Fiscal vulnerabilities had been building up among African governments in the years leading up to the 2020 coronavirus pandemic. And this was due to, on one hand, substantial borrowing activities, with large-scale lending coming from China, who is now the largest creditor in the continent, and on the other hand, greater bond issuance as the region's financial systems developed. COVID-19 has had a severe human and economic cost for African economies, and most of them are now facing recessions in 2020, which will potentially push millions back into poverty. So, the situation calls for a forceful policy response, which includes reinforcing health systems, ramping up emergency food provision, and providing emergency support to vulnerable people, key strategic sectors, and SMEs. African governments are also faced with both shrinking tax revenue and rising expenditure pressures. And the issue is that many of them lack the fiscal space to enact the support measures that their economies need. In response, multilateral institutions like the African Development Bank, the IMF, and the World Bank have increased emergency support by providing loans and grants, which we estimate at around 0.6% of Africa's GDP. And in parallel, the G20 has agreed on a debt service suspension initiative with savings of around 0.6% of national GDP on average for eligible countries. In our report, we examined the level of fiscal support that the international community has provided to individual African nations to help them respond to the crisis effectively. And what we found is that the support provided to date relative to GDP can vary considerably across countries. Now, if you look on the left-hand side of the chart, you'll see that countries like Somalia, Sao Tome and Principe, Gambia, and Sierra Leone have received significant levels of fiscal support from the international community. While on the other side of the chart, countries like Eritrea, Libya, Algeria, and Botswana have benefited less from international relief so far.
International initiatives in support of governments can abet African sovereign governments' creditworthiness. And there has been, positively, an association between the extent of aid extension and the degree of financial need of a vulnerable government. However, debt relief in 2020 has, critically, led to suspension rather than outright forgiveness of debt, and thus predominantly addresses liquidity more than solvency issues. Debt suspension undertaken in 2020 or 2021 can also create adverse repayment humps over future years, especially for those governments already with significant debt service payment requirements in such future years, such as in the cases of Zambia, Capo Verde, Djibouti, Mauritania, and Mozambique, as displayed in this chart. Next, a scenario of private sector involvement in debt suspension could be linked to a temporary default credit rating, potentially restricting market access, at least near term. As such, governments will need to independently judge the benefits of participation in the debt suspension initiative against the costs. If an economy's debt sustainability is indeed adequately enhanced via public and private sector debt relief, this could support stronger market access and lower borrowing rates long term. And with this, bring potentially a stronger credit rating long term.